it opened doors for me in the most magical ways, and people responded to it.
So the show was kind of getting in the way of
Getting in the way of my social life, yes, indeed, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
For 12 years, 2.5 Men was the undisputed king of the American sitcom, a crude yet comfortable juggernaut that seemed bulletproof. But in its final moments, the show didn't end with a heartfelt goodbye or a nostalgic montage. Instead, it collapsed under the weight of a falling grand piano and a decade of real-life spite. It was a bizarre, meta-shattering stunt that killed the protagonist twice. But was it a fitting end, or just a billion-dollar middle finger? The fatal setup, the lead-up to the final hour of 2.5 Men, felt less like a celebration of a legendary sitcom and more like a long-awaited confrontation. For 4 years, the show had existed in a strange, liminal space. Charlie Harper was technically dead, having supposedly been pushed under a subway train by Rose in Paris, yet his presence hung over the Malibu beach house like a thick, cigar-scented fog. When the show transitioned to the Walden Schmidt era, it managed to maintain its massive ratings, but the soul of the series was always tied to the friction between the Harper brothers. As the series finale approached, the rumors began to swirl at a fever pitch. Would he come back? Could the most famous bridge in Hollywood history actually be rebuilt for one night of television? The marketing for the finale, titled "Of Course He's Dead," leaned heavily into this mystery. It wasn't about Alan or Walden or even Jake. It was a psychological game played with the audience. The episode teased the idea that Charlie Harper hadn't died in France at all, but had been held captive in a basement pit by a vengeful Rose. This narrative choice allowed the writers to spend an entire hour poking the bear, referencing Charlie Sheen's real-life meltdowns, his lawsuits, and his public persona. The air was thick with the sense that Chuck Lorre was preparing a final statement, a closing argument in a trial that had been playing out in the tabloids since 2011. Inside the production, the tension was just as high. The crew and the remaining cast were operating under a cloud of secrecy, filming scenes that were designed to mislead anyone looking for a traditional happy ending. Every joke felt pointed, and every reference to Charlie's past felt like a jab at the man who had once been the highest-paid actor on television. The audience was tuned in for a reunion, but the script was being written as an exorcism. It was a setup designed to lure the viewers in with the promise of nostalgia, only to pivot into something much more cynical and shocking. But the true nature of that cynicism wouldn't be clear until the cameras pulled back to reveal the man pulling the strings. The scene in question, the finale of 2.5 Men, didn't just break the fourth wall. It took a sledgehammer to it and then set the remains on fire. Let's picture the millions of viewers sitting on their couches, genuinely expecting a door to open and Charlie Sheen to walk through it. For an hour, the show had teased his return, showing a silhouette of a man in a bowling shirt walking toward the house, claiming his royalties and sending threatening texts. The momentum was building toward a redemptive moment, or at least a final confrontation between the creator and the star. But as the figure finally reached the front door of the Malibu beach house, the reality of the situation shifted from a sitcom to a surrealist nightmare. The camera stayed behind the figure, showing only the back of his head and that iconic patterned shirt. He reached out to ring the doorbell, a gesture that had started hundreds of episodes over the previous decade. But before his finger could even make contact, the whistle of a falling object cut through the air. A grand piano plummeted from the sky, crushing the character instantly in a puff of dust. There was no dialogue, no punchline, and no face revealed. It was a literal Deus ex machina in reverse, a cold, mechanical end to a character that had defined a generation of television. For a split second, the audience was left in a stunned silence, wondering if this was just another dream sequence or a hallucination by Alan Harper. Then, The camera did something the show had never done in 12 years. It pulled back. The lights of the studio set became visible, the boom mics hovered in the frame, and the polished wooden floors of the Harper living room were revealed to be nothing more than painted plywood. In the center of this artificial world sat Chuck Lorre in a director's chair. He wasn't playing a character, he was playing himself, the architect of the empire. He turned his head slowly toward the lens, looked the audience dead in the eye, and uttered a single word with a smirk: winning. It was the ultimate callback to Sheen's infamous 2011 media blitz, a moment of pure, unadulterated, petty triumph. The irony, however, was doubled. Just as the word left Lorre's lips, a second grand piano fell, crushing the creator of the show just as it had crushed his creation. The screen cut to black immediately, followed by the silent credits. It was a double execution. Lorre wasn't just killing off Charlie Harper for a second time. He was acknowledging the toxicity of the entire situation by killing himself off as well. The message was loud and clear. The house was empty. The actors were gone. And the creator had the last laugh, even if he had to die to get it. This wasn't the kind of ending that left fans feeling warm. It was jarring, uncomfortable, and deeply meta. It felt less like a finale and more like a public legal settlement disguised as entertainment. The show had spent years being a broad, accessible comedy about a rich jingle writer and his uptight brother. But in its final 60 seconds, it became a private joke between two millionaires. The winning line was the final twist of the knife, a way for Lorre to reclaim the narrative that Sheen had tried to steal during his public breakdown. By putting himself in the frame, Lorre stopped being a producer and became a character in his own war, proving that in the world of 2.5 Men, the only thing more famous than the show was the hatred behind the scenes. The roots of this televised execution go back much further than a single episode. They were planted in the tiny blink and you'll miss it text blocks that ended every broadcast. The Vanity Card War. For over a decade, the most important part of 2.5 Men didn't happen during the show itself, but in the final second of the broadcast. While other producers used their production company logos to display a simple animation or a catchy jingle, Chuck Lorre used his vanity cards as a digital diary, a manifesto, and eventually a weapon of war. These cards, numbered and archived, were blocks of text that appeared on the screen for a fraction of a second, just long enough for a dedicated viewer to hit the pause button. They were often philosophical, sometimes neurotic, and frequently hilarious. But as the relationship between Lorre and Charlie Sheen began to crumble in the late 2000s, these cards became the front line of a very public, very passive-aggressive battle. The vanity cards were the original social media of the sitcom world before Twitter became the primary battleground for celebrity feuds. Lorre would use them to vent about the stresses of production, his own health anxieties, and eventually the erratic behavior of his lead star. When the show was at its peak, the cards were a quirky bonus for superfans. However, when Sheen's personal life began to spill onto the set, the tone of the cards shifted. They became increasingly pointed, referencing the difficulty of working with someone who seemed intent on self-destruction. Lorre was essentially live blogging the slow-motion car crash of his own show right under the nose of the network and the star himself. By the time the infamous Season 8 meltdown occurred, the vanity cards were no longer subtle. Following Sheen's public disparagement of Lorre, calling him a clown and a stupid little man, Lorre responded through card number 329. In it, he didn't just defend himself. He laid out the grim reality of a production being held hostage by its lead actor's lifestyle. He wrote about the physical toll of the stress and the absurdity of the winning narrative that Sheen was peddling to the press. This wasn't just corporate damage control. It was a creator reclaiming his dignity in the only space he truly controlled. It was the first time many viewers realized that the funny show they watched every Monday was actually being produced in a climate of genuine hostility and fear. The finale's double piano scene was the ultimate vanity card. It was as if Laurie realized that a block of text at the end of the show wasn't enough to exorcise the demons of the last 4 years. He needed to step out from behind the curtain and be the vanity card himself. By appearing on screen and saying the word winning, he was effectively closing the book on a decade of secret messages. He was telling the audience that the subtext was now the text. The cards had always been a way for Laurie to have the last word in every episode, and by killing himself and his lead character on screen, he ensured he would have the last word in the entire series' history. The irony of the Vanity Card War is that it created a legacy of meta-commentary that predated the modern era of prestige TV breaking the fourth wall. 2.5 Men was, on the surface, a very traditional, very safe multi-camera sitcom. But the Vanity Cards gave it a dark, experimental edge. They reminded the audience that there was a real human being behind the canned laughter. Someone who was frustrated, exhausted, and eventually vengeful. As much as the cards revealed Laurie's mindset, the most shocking part of the finale wasn't what was on the screen, but who refused to be there. The refusal. The most haunting aspect of the 2.5 Men finale wasn't the falling piano, but the empty space where a living, breathing Charlie Sheen should have been standing. For months leading up to the taping of the final episode, the entertainment industry was buzzing with a single question. Would they actually do it? Would the most successful creator in television and his disgraced former star shake hands for one final curtain call? The answer, as it turns out, was buried in a series of heated negotiations, rejected scripts, and a fundamental disagreement over what constitutes a happy ending. Chuck Lorre did actually extend an olive branch, but it was an olive branch wrapped in barbed wire. According to Lorre's own account, he reached out to Sheen with a specific pitch for the finale. The idea was for Sheen to walk up to the door in the final scene, ring the bell, and then turn to the camera to deliver a terrifying manic rant about the dangers of substances abuse. He was supposed to look like a cautionary tale, a broken man who had lost everything, before the piano eventually fell and ended his story. Lorre saw this as a moment of meta-honesty, a way for the show to acknowledge the real-life darkness that had led to Sheen's firing 4 years earlier. It was designed to be a PSA disguised as a sitcom punchline, a way to bridge the gap between the character Charlie Harper and the actor Charlie Sheen. Sheen, however, had a very different vision for his return. He didn't want to be a punchline, and he certainly didn't want to be a PSA. Reports from the time suggest that Sheen countered with an idea he called the Harpers, a setup for a potential spin-off series that would feature him and John Cryer returning to their old dynamic. He wanted a heartwarming scene that would signal to the fans that all was forgiven and that the show could live on in a new form. He wanted to reclaim his status as the hero of the story, the lovable rogue who had survived the storm. To Sheen, the finale should have been a victory lap. To Lorre, it was a funeral. Because neither man was willing to blink, the negotiation hit a brick wall. Sheen refused to show up for a scene that he felt mocked his personal struggles, and Lorre refused to write a scene that he felt ignored the chaos Sheen had caused for the production crew. The result was the body double we saw on screen. By using a stand-in who looked like Sheen from behind, Lorre was able to execute his vision without the actual star's consent. It was a cold, clinical way to handle a legacy. It signaled to the world that the show didn't need the man anymore. It only needed the shirt and the silhouette. The refusal to appear in the finale effectively sealed the show's fate as a tragedy dressed up as a comedy. If Sheen had walked through that door, the piano drop might have felt like a joke between friends. Without him, it felt like an execution of an absent defendant. The absence of Sheen's face in the final frame created a void. It reminded everyone that the winning was a hollow boast. The man who made the show a hit wasn't there to take the bow, and the man who ran the show wasn't interested in giving him one. It was the ultimate stalemate, frozen in time by a piece of falling musical equipment. This creative divorce didn't just hurt the actors, it left the people who had watched the show for over a decade feeling like they were caught in the middle of someone else's messy breakup. The audience betrayal. While the piano drop was a cathartic moment for Chuck Lorre, it landed with a thud for the millions of viewers who had tuned in faithfully for over a decade. For many, the finale felt less like a celebration of a sitcom legend and more like being invited to a party only to watch the host and the guest of honor get into a screaming match in the kitchen. Television is often described as a relationship between the characters and the audience, a silent contract where the viewers invest their time and emotion in exchange for a story that makes sense. By turning the series finale into a meta-commentary on a real-life legal battle, Two and a Half Men essentially tore up that contract in front of everyone. The problem wasn't just that Charlie Sheen didn't show up. It was that the show stopped pretending to be a show. Throughout the final hour, characters like Alan and Walden would look directly into the camera, making jokes about how they had been on the air for too long or how the plot points didn't make any sense. While breaking the fourth wall can be a clever narrative device, here it felt dismissive. It signaled to the fans that the writers didn't care about the world they had built in Malibu. They were essentially telling the audience that the characters they loved, the neurotic Alan, the growing Jake, the sharp-tongued Berta, were just props in a larger game of industry spite. The fans who had stuck with the show through the Walden-Schmidt transition were particularly stung. Those viewers had proven their loyalty by staying through a massive cast change, helping the show remain a ratings powerhouse even after its lead star was fired in a blaze of tiger blood and Adonis DNA. They deserved an ending that honored the journey of the characters. Instead, they got a 60-minute inside joke. The finale didn't resolve Alan's eternal struggle for independence or give Walden a meaningful send-off. It spent its runtime litigating a 2011 tabloid scandal that most people had already moved on from. There is a specific kind of cynicism that comes with a finale like this. It's the feeling that the creators have become bored with their own creation. When Chuck Lorre stepped onto the screen to say, "Winning," he wasn't just poking fun at Charlie Sheen. He was reminding the audience that he was the boss, and they were just the consumers. It was a move that felt profoundly ungrateful to the people who had made Lorre one of the most powerful men in television. By the time the credits rolled in silence, the message wasn't "thanks for watching," but "I'm glad this is finally over." The backlash was reflected almost immediately in the ratings and the reviews. While the viewership numbers were high due to the curiosity factor, the post-show sentiment was overwhelmingly negative. On forums and social media, fans expressed a sense of finale fatigue. They had expected a reunion and received a middle finger. It remains one of the most divisive endings in sitcom history, often cited alongside the finales of Seinfeld or How I Met Your Mother as a moment where the creators prioritized their own vision over the audience's emotional investment. In the case of Two and a Half Men, however, that vision wasn't even artistic. It was personal. Let's look back at the years when it wasn't a battlefield, but a billion-dollar gold mine, to understand how the show earned the right to have such a massive, messy ending. A decade of dominance. The show wasn't just a popular sitcom, it was a cultural gravitational constant. Starting in 2003, The show arrived at a time when critics were already starting to write the obituary for the traditional multi-camera sitcom. The era of Friends obituary for the traditional multi-camera sitcom. The era of Friends and Frasier was winding down, and the industry was looking toward single-camera, quirkier shows like Arrested Development or The Office. Yet, Chuck Lorre and Lee Aronson doubled down on the classic format, the live audience, the three-wall sets, and the set-up punchline rhythm, and created a juggernaut that would dominate the ratings for the next 12 years. The success of the show was built on a brand of humor that was unapologetically broad and consistently blue. It didn't try to be high-concept or intellectually demanding. It was a show about a man-child with too much money and a man-child with none, living together in a house that everyone in America secretly wished they owned. At its height, the show was pulling in 15 to 20 million viewers a week in the United States alone. Those are numbers that today's streaming hits can only dream of. It was the kind of success that made the network, the creators, and the stars incredibly wealthy, with Charlie Sheen eventually earning a record-breaking $1.8 million per episode. But the real power of 2.5 Men wasn't in its first-run airings, it was in syndication. The show became the ultimate background noise for a generation. Whether you were in a sports bar, a doctor's office, or a hotel room, there was a high statistical probability that an episode of 2.5 Men was playing on a screen nearby. It was a billion-dollar property because it was infinitely repeatable. You didn't need to have seen the previous 10 episodes to understand the joke in the current one. This accessibility made it a global phenomenon, translated into dozens of languages and broadcast in nearly every country with a television signal. This dominance gave the creators a level of job security that is rare in Hollywood. When you are the #1 comedy on television, the network tends to stay out of your way. This autonomy is likely what allowed the toxicity behind the scenes to grow unchecked for so long. Because the money was flowing so freely, the red flags regarding Sheen's lifestyle and the growing resentment between him and Lorre were often swept under the rug in favor of one more season. The show's success became its shield, protecting it from the consequences of its internal friction until the pressure finally became too great to contain. In many ways, the show's dominance is what made the finale so shocking. For a decade, 2.5 Men had been the safe choice for CBS, a reliable, predictable hit. To see it end with a surrealist stunt involving falling pianos and a director breaking character was a total reversal of the show's brand. It was as if the most mainstream product in America had suddenly decided to become an avant-garde art film for its final 5 minutes. The sheer scale of the show's success meant that when it finally hit the ground, the impact was felt across the entire landscape of television. Yet, all the money and ratings in the world wouldn't have mattered if the audience didn't believe in the dysfunctional family at the center of the beach house. The chemistry of 3. The secret sauce of 2.5 Men wasn't the beach house or the expensive cars, it was the volatile, perfect chemistry between Charlie Sheen, Jon Cryer, and Angus T. Jones. In the early seasons, the show operated like a well-oiled comedic machine, utilizing a classic odd couple dynamic that was updated for a more cynical, modern era. Charlie Sheen played a version of himself that the public was already fascinated by, a charismatic, unapologetic hedonist who seemed to glide through life without consequences. Opposite him was Jon Cryer's Alan Harper, a man who was the personification of a consequence. The friction between Charlie's effortless cool and Alan's desperate, high-strung neurosis provided a bottomless well of conflict that felt both grounded and hilarious. Then there was the half. Angus T. Jones, as Jake Harper, was the essential ingredient that prevented the show from becoming too mean-spirited. In the beginning, Jake served as the innocent observer of his father's failures and his uncle's excesses. The comedy often came from the adults trying and failing to shield the child from their own bad behavior. This trio created a domestic unit that was deeply flawed but strangely relatable. They were a family of cast-offs, a divorced father, a bachelor uncle who didn't know how to grow up, and a kid caught in the middle. This resonated with an audience that was increasingly living in non-traditional households. As the years went by, the chemistry evolved. We watched Jake grow from a sweet, slightly dim-witted kid into a cynical, lazy teenager, a transition that mirrored the show's own shift toward darker, more adult humor. Meanwhile, the supporting cast, Holland Taylor as the icy matriarch Evelyn and Conchata Ferrell as the sharp-tongued housekeeper Berta, acted as the Greek chorus, mocking the men for their incompetence. Every character had a specific lane, and they stayed in it with surgical precision. This consistency is what allowed the show to survive for so long. The audience knew exactly how Evelyn would react to Alan's misery or how Berta would shut down Charlie's ego. However, lightning in a bottle is notoriously hard to contain. As the real-life distance between Sheen and the rest of the production grew, that on-screen chemistry began to show signs of strain. The effortless banter started to feel scripted, and the warmth that occasionally peeked through the insults began to evaporate. By the time the show reached its 8th season, the two in the title were barely functioning as a team. The magic was fading, replaced by a sense of obligation. When the explosion finally happened and Sheen was removed from the equation, many assumed the show would vanish instantly, believing that you couldn't replace a third of a winning trifecta and expect the machine to keep running. The show didn't vanish. Instead, it underwent a radical organ transplant that defied the laws of sitcom physics. The Walden era. When Charlie Sheen was fired in 2011, the conventional wisdom in Hollywood was that 2.5 Men was dead. You don't simply remove the two and expect the half and the other one to carry a billion-dollar franchise. Yet, the introduction of Ashton Kutcher as Walden Schmidt was a radical pivot that defied the laws of sitcom physics. Walden wasn't a replacement for Charlie Harper, he was his opposite. Where Charlie was a cynical, world-weary hedonist, Walden was a sensitive, broken-hearted internet billionaire who entered the show by trying to drown himself in the ocean because he missed his wife. This shift changed the show from a story about a brother leeching off a winner to a story about two men trying to figure out adulthood in a world that had outgrown them. The Walden era was a fascinating experiment in brand survival. Kutcher brought a younger, more energetic vibe to the set, and for a few seasons, it worked. The ratings remained remarkably high, proving that the brand of 2.5 Men, the pacing, the beach house, and John Cryer's Emmy-winning performance was larger than any single actor. However, as the seasons progressed, the show began to lean even harder into the meta-humor that would eventually define the finale. It was as if the writers were constantly acknowledging the absurdity of the show's continued existence. They joked about how Walden was just a rich guy who bought the set, and they leaned into increasingly surreal plot lines, including Walden and Alan getting married to adopt a child. By the time the show reached its 12th season, the Walden era had served its purpose. It had kept the lights on long enough for the show to reach a massive syndication milestone. But the shadow of the original two never really went away. The show had become a strange hybrid of its former self, a sitcom that was surviving on momentum rather than the lightning-in-a-bottle chemistry of the early years. The Walden era proved that the show was a machine designed to produce jokes at any cost, but it also set the stage for the cynical ending. After 4 years of trying to be something new, the creators decided to end it by looking back at the man who started it all. Not with a handshake, but with a grand piano. The show didn't just fade away, it chose to self-destruct in a way that ensured it would be talked about long after the laughter stopped. If you enjoyed this deep dive into sitcom history, Be sure to subscribe for more behind-the-scenes autopsies of television's biggest moments.